I train startup founders and salespeople primarily. I entitle most of my presentations authentic sales because I'll go through my personal journey and grappling with my own identity and how to find my authentic voice in sales. Sales, if you stereotypically think about the profession, you see a lot of things like Wolf on Wall Street. Have you all seen that movie or heard of it? I don't know if you've heard of Glenn Ross. It's an older school movie, but there's like a famous clip in there where one of the trainers or the managers is talking about ABC, always be closing. And it's this very aggressive macho guy who's basically making salespeople feel bad about not hitting their quota. And I passionately believe that's not the way to do sales. I think there's a softer, intentional, more thoughtful way to do sales. And that's how I grew up in the sales profession, even though today there are still a lot of people who, have this tech bro image of being aggressive and pushy. And so it's my mission to talk to as many people as possible to tell them those stereotypes are not reality. And the best salespeople actually sometimes even can be introverted, not very social, but still very thoughtful. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Today, in terms of the content, I'm going to start with just a little bit about my story, what I do in a little bit more depth. I'll then transition to some phraseology and mentalities that I try and untrain out of founders because of what I said around what people think sales typically is. Sound good? Perfect. Okay, so a little bit more about my experience. I'm a Korean American sales coach. I purposely mention I'm Korean American. There's not a lot of Korean Americans who aspire to be salespeople, but my hope is that more and more will. I have over 15 years of experience. I started my career at Google when there were about 40,000 employees. I sold AdWords there, so the traditional text ads, but then I transitioned to television commercials, actually, and that was when YouTube was starting to become big, and so I sold a lot of the midstream ads. At Google, I was like, you know what, this is a big company. I feel kind of like a cog within a machine. Let me see what startups are out there. A buddy of mine who I play basketball with, actually, still to this day, he was working at Dropbox, and they were a small 80-person startup. And they were a consumer brand, but I saw kind of the opportunity for them to transition into selling to businesses directly instead of to consumers. So I went to Dropbox, ended up closing their first Fortune 500 customer in NBCUniversal. So this was their first 3-year multi-million-dollar deal. And then Dropbox got big. So I was like, okay, this is like not as fun anymore. What other startups are out there? And Slack was a startup at the time. And they were like, hey, Peter, you've negotiated with NBCUniversal, Turner, News Corp. Can you come do the same? Because we're talking to the same people you worked with. So I was like, you know what, maybe Dropbox was a fluke. Maybe I'm not actually a good salesperson. Let me go to Slack, see if I can help them with the same transition. So I was at Slack, helped them close some big logos. Disney was a big deal there that I closed. And then Slack got big. So I was like, what other startups are out there? And Front is an email collaboration tool. There were about 20 employees at the time, and they had no business-to-business motion. So everything was through the website. And I was like, you know what? Can we actually go after businesses and see if they can give Front, this tiny startup, some actual like meaty contracts? So I helped set up the business there. And then I was like, okay, like I've been at big companies, smaller companies, but I've never been at a company with 0 customers, right? Because even at Front, they had 2 million in revenue, which is, a good start. So I went to a company called Twingate in cybersecurity. So does anybody know what virtual private networks are, or VPN? Is that familiar? Yeah, so Twingate was going up against Cisco, Palo Alto Networks, Zscaler. These are the big players in this space. And I said, you know what, in my career, I've never been at a company that had 0 customers. So maybe Front, Slack, Dropbox, maybe those were flukes. So I joined Twingate and I was like, okay, how do we actually go up against the big incumbents as an underdog? And so I helped them over 2.5 years grow from 0 to 600 customers, a huge team effort. I learned a lot about not only sales, but marketing and how to actually be honest about how small you are when you're going up against the likes of billion-dollar companies. So where does this take me today? Now I have gotten the confidence at 39 years old that I am actually potentially good at sales, and I want to be able to impact a very specific style of sales to companies at the earliest stages. So today, I focus typically on pre-seed to seed stage founders. So does anybody know what that means? Okay, so these are like, if you think about a seed, it's at the very beginning of a plan, right? So these are the earliest stage companies you can find. And they are the ones that are raising money for the first time in their company's existence. So pre-seed round, they could raise like maybe $200,000-$300,000 to get started. A big seed round could be like $4 or $5 million. And this is money capital to start your business. I know it seems like a lot of money, but once you start hiring people and you start, actually working through the problems, it goes pretty fast too, which is another story. But I help companies that are selling B2B. B2B is business to business. So usually these companies are going after not just NBCUniversal, but even like a 500-person company. It's different from selling to a human, like one-to-one human, right? There's multiple stakeholders involved, multiple decision makers, and there's a story arc you need to tell. And what I'm going to try and focus on mentalities that I think you could hopefully like port over to your business to consumer companies. But yes, typically right now I work with business to business founders. And they haven't ever done sales before. That's who I like to work with because they come in with fresh mindsets. And again, I'm really trying to get them to embody the mentality of feeling confident in sales, because a lot of folks come to me and they're like, I don't like sales because I'm not the always be closing type of girl or gal. So these are some of the companies I work with. So how did I get there before my professional journey? I'm going to talk about this a little bit because I kind of have a lot of trauma as a kid, actually. And I think it's important to talk about that as an adult now. So I was born in Korea in 1986. I moved to New York when I was like 11 months old. And then from New York, I moved to California for a year. And then from California, my family decided to move to Korea again. And that was like a crazy experience because people were making fun of me for my accent. I was like still finding myself and was bullied because they were like, oh, there's that American kid, So that kind of was a really interesting experience. And then from that, I went to Michigan. And in Michigan, a lot of people made fun of me too, because I was one of two Korean families, two Asian families at the school. And so I have this vivid memory of getting on the school bus and these like kids would consistently, do this with their eyes. They'd be like, oh, you have super small eyes, like squinty Chinese eyes, right? So I like feared getting on the school bus. And then I went to California, and that was a whole nother thing because there were a bunch of Asians in California actually. But then like there's these seniors driving like Range Rovers and BMWs, and I was like, what is going on? I was in Palo Alto. And so they're like, oh, my dad's like an executive at Apple. So then I like felt like an outsider then too, because I was like, oh my gosh, like even being middle class isn't enough here, right? Like I don't have a Range Rover. So why do I mention this is because I wasn't confident as a kid, actually. I'd say even like in my professional career, as I was at Dropbox, I look super happy here. I wasn't like very confident. I was always trying to fit in. And in the sales profession, people didn't look like me. There weren't a lot of minorities. There were a lot of people who loved golfing, who had like a country club like toting families, right? And there were a lot of silver spoons in the room. So in internal meetings, I was always like the last to speak because I was deathly afraid of sticking out. And I felt more comfortable actually working with my customers than being an internal employee. So imagine that. And it's interesting too, because a lot of people say, there's a lot of diversity in tech. And there is, but in certain professions, it's very lopsided, right? There's a lot of engineers, there's a lot of product managers who are Asian, and there are minorities now, but the landscape is still pretty bleak, I would say, which is why I'm really passionate about helping minorities, people who feel like outsiders, people who don't feel like they quite fit in. And by the way, that goes beyond minorities too, right? And it's because this stat, I think, needs to change, right? Like the promotion path for Asian Americans is not what it should be. And so a lot of what I do is focus on phraseology, because I was like thinking about this. I was like, okay, like if the structure today is not quite set up to be inclusive, I better be really good at speaking, right? I better be laser sharp, because when I say something, I want people to listen to me. So I didn't have a podium at home, but I would look at a mirror and I would actually like recite phrasing like all the time, And I was like, you know what? English is my second language. I was born Korean. I feel like a little bit behind the curve. So again, I'm going to practice, because if I practice, maybe I can get to the level of a native English speaker, because in sales, what you say and how you say it is very, very important. And so I turned a perceived weakness actually into a superpower, because today, even native English speakers will ask me, how do you say certain things, which is kind of mind-boggling to me, being that kid who was made fun of. Now people are asking me, how do I communicate? And so I think that's one of the things I want you all to take away is, your childhood trauma, your experiences, hopefully you all don't have too much trauma, but we all carry baggage. How are you going to use that to actually turn it into an advantage? Because it's very possible, and I'm living that today. So now I coach startups to confidently pitch their vision. So now let me go on to hopefully like the good stuff for you all, which is I've worked with hundreds of startups at this point, and I've worked at a few of them as well. And I think there's three things that really stand out to me that I'd love to impart to you all. Obviously, it's not just three things. There's like 20 things, but I can't be here for 5 hours. And the first thing is founder vision is so important. People, even in BDC companies, like why do people write about founders? Why do people write about Drew Houston or Steve Jobs at the time? Because the founder vision can shape the trajectory of the company, right? So I'm going to give you like an example of phrasing you should think about when actually conveying founder vision. The other thing that a lot of startups have is they have burning pain points. So when I meet a startup founder, oftentimes they jump into, here's what my product does, but that's not as interesting to me actually. What's more interesting is, what the heck does your product solve for? Like, why is this a problem for people today? Because without a problem, people aren't going to give you money, right? And without money, your startup's not going to survive. And then the last thing is, you have to really think about, what is your differentiator? What makes you one of one? Not one of 10, not one of 5, one of one. Because there's so much noise out there today that you really need to double down on what makes your decision-making even highly unique. Okay, so I'm gonna go through, because I focus a lot on phrasing, I'm gonna go through just 3 examples of phrasing. So again, buyers are making a strategic bet on you. Think about that, right? Even for a consumer company, you want your brain to be reflected in the product. And so what I would say is, like, a lot of founders come to me, and I listen to a lot of calls too, by the way, because there's nothing more important than hearing somebody talk to a potential customer about their product. And I hear this like all the time. I'm gonna walk you through everything in the product today. And it's like a dangerous misstep. And there's a couple reasons. One is the harbor tour is overwhelming, right? Do you all like the harbor tours? When you get on a boat in a harbor, at a harbor tour, they like focus on going to every stop, right? They're like, okay, here's what this landmark is. Here's what this landmark is. Like, tour guides are conditioned to be comprehensive, right? Because you're only taking that tour one time. But it's overwhelming. People zone out when you're talking too much about your product. And it doesn't get to the root of the pain point, right? Like, even just getting to the root of the pain point takes time. So if you're overtaking the conversation with your product, you're missing an opportunity. And you're also not a robot. Like, sometimes I listen to these calls and people are talking for like 2 to 3 minutes straight. I mean, I know I'm talking straight right now, but it's a different context. But imagine if you're in a one-to-one conversation and somebody's talking for even like 40 seconds straight. Try it later. It's really tiring to pay attention, right? So what's another kind of way to reframe this? Instead of saying companies buy products or people buy products, you could reframe this to say companies or people bet on founders. And so I like to kind of like workshop phrasing where I get people to talk about their story, right? So what is the origin story of your company? And something like this phrase can be really powerful. I've thought about this problem at length and have a very specific perspective on it. You are creating the space to show that you are unique, that you're one of one. And again, buyers buy into your thought process. I think that's as interesting, if not more interesting, than your product. especially in the early stages, right? Because your product's not going to do everything day one. So then what are they buying? They're buying the promise of what you're selling. Buyers buy into your passion. So like, think about what is your passion. It's very obvious when I meet founders who are chasing an opportunity, not a passion. And if you're not chasing a passion, it's really hard when things get hard. You tend to give up. And in enterprise sales, this is business to business sales. This word comes up all the time. I've interviewed like probably 15 of my customers, now 10 years removed. So 10 years ago, I started selling at Dropbox, like 11 years ago. And I would say, hey, like Lenny, he's the guy at NBC, what made you buy from me or Dropbox, right? And he said, it was just very apparent that I could trust you. Because you didn't have all the bells and whistles, by the way. You didn't have like 50 things my constituents at NBC were looking for, but I knew when things got tough, you would be there and that you could solve critical problems with us as partners. So think about that, right? Again, this is a business to business standpoint, but like people want to trust you, right? Trust your brand, even on a consumer level, right? You all buy from brands you trust. Okay, the second example. So yes. Longevity, definitely, yeah. No, thanks for mentioning that. I'm glad you have been talking about it because longevity wins. You know, your startup's not going to do this, right? It's going to do this. It's going to go up and down. So in the down moments, are you going to love what you're solving for? The other thing, like I said, you have to solve burning pain points. You have to solve a must-have, not a nice-to-have, in my opinion. It's so noisy, even on the consumer side, right? Like how many apps? I mean, I have tons of apps on my phone. So how are you going to stand out? It has to be a must-have, and you have to position it as that. So, you know, this is like a common phrase that I hear. We think this is something everyone could use. It's not that interesting though, because it's not enough to be building off of assumptions, right? You can't just be making assumptions off of what people need. And building off of requests distracts from the root of what you're solving for, right? So if you're actually like in enterprise sales, B2B sales, a lot of people are like, can you build this? Can you build that, right? It's not highly opinionated if you're just like, okay, let me build it into the product. And this is, I think, something people could use. A better way to say this is to add a little bit more color in terms of phraseology, right? There's currently no easy way to solve for this, and businesses are wasting money, time, and resources on the problem. So getting really specific and starting with this is super, super helpful, right? So think about what is the big cost of not working with your product or not adopting your product. And why is this good to like start saying? Obviously, there's a lot more you should say after that, right? To actually quantify, okay, how much time are you wasting? What resources are you actually taking away from? But where there are pains, there's budget. That's always the case. If it's a nice to have, people aren't really gonna shell out their wallet. And the opportunity cost of not using your product has to be super, super high. By the way, these phrases, like they're pretty basic, right? Like we all understand them. But I can't tell you like the number of times it takes to actually execute on this, even with like founders who are extremely brilliant. I'm talking like former Google, Uber, like Meta engineers. Sometimes they don't say the most basic things because they make assumptions, right? That, oh, like, yeah, this is obvious why this is great. No, you have to quantify why should it be obvious? What's the money, time, and resources that are wasted because you're not working with me? And then the last thing before I go on to questions is you have to sell your competitive advantage. And I'm going to talk about pricing here as kind of like a mentality, because in business sales, a lot of people get pricing wrong. In consumer sales too, by the way, I look at a lot of companies and I'm like, why is this so cheap? Right? Like if you're trying to get into the market, you're a product of your own experience too. And I'm always used to having the conversation of this is expensive because. And I wish more founders would do that, first-time founders, because their products are truly game-changing. So if you have a game-changing product, you shouldn't say like, hey, candidly, you'd be a big customer so I can provide a discount. Or you should limit the amount of times you say, hey, I can provide a discount because. Because when you start doing that, it cheapens your product, right? There's like this very real psychological impact of saying I have a cheap product. And I think you should charge off of value, not the size of your pipeline. Pipeline, the definition of this is like how many potential customers you have, not necessarily how many customers have you sold. But just because you don't initially have a ton of potential customers, it doesn't mean you should say, hey, I'm going to discount the product so I can get into the market. There's some, by the way, consumer companies that take this strategy. I just would, and you might still take this strategy by the discounting. I'm not saying don't ever discount. But what I'm saying is think about the other side to make sure you're not cheapening your product, right? Think about, is there a way I can inject this into the market by being a premium player that's one of one? And so another way to do this, when especially in business sales, when you come out with a discount, you seem really weak. So I coach founders to say, hey, don't say that they're going to be a big customer. Doesn't matter if you have 0 customers. Don't say you're going to give a discount because they're special, right? You're special, right? There's a lot of people you could sell, but there's only one product you're building, right? So I train people to say, we believe this is a fair price because of the value and cost savings we'd be providing. That being said, can I ask how you're thinking about price, right? So it's a subtle difference. And by the way, at the end of that, when you hear, oh, this is how I think about price, Peter, like I'm not going to buy this for more than $10, you might still like actually give a discount, right? But psychologically, you seem a little bit more valuable, or a lot more valuable, I should say, because you're setting your technology at a premium. And also it helps you to restate your value, right? So it's not about the features of your product, it's about what are you truly solving for. And like I said, you could still be open-minded, but starting with, hey, like this is a fair price because will help you a lot. Because once start people asking, why is this so expensive? A lot of people say, well, I can give you a discount. Again, that's, I think, a really risky move and sets you up for failure. Okay, so as a kind of summary of these 3 points, really truly figure out what is your founder vision, solve burning problems, don't solve for nice to haves because it's going to be really, really hard to sustain your company. And then surface your technical moat or your differentiator. Let me, I actually changed this word on the previous slide because I realize a lot of people don't know what technical moat means, but technical moat is, so do you guys all know what a moat is? A moat is, you know, in the old like castle days, they would have like water around the castle, right? To guard against intruders. And so in technology, a lot of people talk about what is your technical moat? Like what is going to protect you against your competitors? Because your competitors tend to be your enemies, right? So that directly ties into what is your differentiator? What decision did you make when you're building your company that nobody can attack? And I have a video on this on my YouTube channel you could look at where I talk about the Dropbox technical moat. And so I'll give you like a short snippet of a story on that. But Dropbox's main competitor, do you guys know who that was, by the way? Anybody? Okay, so there were a lot of competitors, but the main ones I was going up against was Microsoft and Box. Kind of confusing, right? Because there's Dropbox and Box. But Box took the like B2B approach, whereas Dropbox, before I started there, was consumer, right? They were going like after consumers directly. And so when I was trying to sell Dropbox, a lot of customers would be like, Peter, like, what are you doing meeting with me? Like Box has all these like business specific features. You can put a password on links. I can be sure if somebody's sharing the link outside my organization that my security team knows about it, and you guys don't have any of that. So how do you expect to sell to businesses? And both platforms uploaded files into the cloud, right? So this is where I had to go into my technical moat talk track. I had to say, listen, like your users will prefer Dropbox because our founders made a very specific decision when they built the product. And that's around Delta Sync. So what is Delta Sync? Nobody knew what it was until we explained it. Delta Sync is if you're uploading a file, let's say like Saturday Night Live is uploading an episode, and after 50% of the upload, you close your laptop and you go to the parking lot and drive away. When you get to another spot with internet connection, the latter 50% uploads, right? Because it uploads the difference. So it's not like you lost the work of the 50%. Box at the time in like 2014, 2015, you know, a lot of people said Box is losing my files. And they weren't actually losing the file. It's just that like, even if you're uploading 90% of the file, if you're to lose internet connection and you go somewhere else with internet, it would have to start from the very beginning. So you lost 98% of the file upload. So that's a technical moat. This is a decision Drew and Arash made in their bedrooms or their garage or wherever they were building Dropbox. And it had a huge implication for businesses, because then I'd be able to say, listen, we have a technical moat. That box can't change overnight. The decision they made on that upload path was the wrong decision, especially for media companies. So what is that decision that you're gonna make, even on like day 1 or 2 or 3, that is gonna give you a technical advantage? Because 2 of the same products can be very, very different under the hood. So think about that, right? Because that's the storytelling I had to go with repeatedly. And then underpinning all of this, again, is like, how do you say what you're saying? You know, people take conversationalists seriously if they are sharp. So the words, the tone, how you show up is really, really important. That's why a lot of people call me like a sales therapist too. Because like yesterday, the other day, this guy was like, hey, Peter, can I get on the phone with you? I'm really nervous about a negotiation. So then I have to say, like, remember, there's no other technology like yours. You're making a huge impact. Don't be nervous because they're gonna be combative. Just like really calm down and go back to, you know, your root technical moat. So, okay, that is the rest. That's kind of the entirety of the presentation, but I wanted to leave you with one quote. I'm not like a Chanel fan, but I like this quote. Coco Chanel is like the French designer. In order to be irreplaceable, one must always be different. So think about that. I wish I understood that as a kid. High school was super stressful for me because I think I was trying to be like everyone else, and I wanted, you know, that Range Rover or BMW in the high school parking lot. But my differences and my experiences made me who I am, right? And I would really think about that. And the more experiences you go through that are uniquely you, the better equipped you'll be when you're building your company too. So that's it. I'll leave like 25 or so minutes for questions. Hopefully that was helpful. Yeah, go ahead. Say that again. Oh, my YouTube channel is Peter on Sales. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. And then I don't know if you all are starting to use LinkedIn. Do you all use LinkedIn? Oh, good. I post content on LinkedIn like every other day. Yeah. You'll see Howard on there. I posted a picture of him. Yeah. Go ahead. Oh, great. Thank you very much. Yeah. That is a stereotype, right? Of like people being desperate to sell their stuff. And yeah, I have like a very different approach. I don't like to follow up with people, actually, ironically, because if you're bothering them to reply to you, they're not interested, right? You did something wrong on the first impression. So, and I hope people see sales that way, because then I think we'll have a lot more clarity in terms of what people want to buy, right? But we're hit on the head with cold calls, cold emails, and it's just becoming so watered down. And so I hope the next generation really embodies this approach of like, hey, like I have something special. I'm going to create value in the world to show that I have something special. And if they have a problem about a problem that I can help solve, they're going to come to me, right? So yeah, appreciate you appreciating that. Cool, go ahead. I don't. I focus mostly on like companies that sell into larger businesses. But funny enough, a lot of small businesses still approach me. So I'll help if they're like friends of mine, right? But I don't really help like on a formal basis. But yeah, is there like kind of a specific reason you're asking about that? Are you starting yeah. Good, cool. I think a lot of the same concepts exist, right? If you're gonna open a restaurant, figure out what is your competitive advantage. Why are people gonna say, oh, this restaurant is more authentic than another? And then also think about partnering, right? If you're a restaurant, you're gonna be buying a lot of things, you're gonna be selling a lot of things, not just to consumers, but yeah, how are you gonna like think about negotiating the lease, right? How are you gonna think about, creating a menu, right? How are you gonna think about being different, right? Yeah. But I don't unfortunately formally help. It's not in my wheelhouse. I just have a lot of friends who have opened up businesses or who are like creating even like consumer packaged goods, right? Yeah. So what I would say is like, I'm sure a lot of you are gonna do this, but speak to as many people as possible who are in your ideal customer profile, right? Think about, okay, who is my ideal customer? And can I talk to like 20 of them? And when I talk to 20 of them, don't think about pitching your product right away, right? Think about asking, hey, what's like, how many burgers do you eat a week? Are you selling burgers? Cheeseburgers are my favorite thing to eat. If I could, I would eat it like 3 meals a day. But like, ask them like, how many burgers do you eat? What are your thoughts on burgers? What are your pains around buying a burger? Right? Like, what's the taste you're looking for? What kind of meat do you like? Would you actually buy from a burger place that has this kind of twist to it? You know, and so I think like that is very relevant for business to consumer as well. You want to be able to ask the right questions, not make assumptions, and figure out, okay, are there pain points with the other alternatives they're going after? So yeah, hopefully that helps. Yeah, my favorite organization. So my favorite organizations are, my favorite founders, I'll start there, are the ones who are introverted, who are highly technical, like really good engineers, right? And who are very nervous about sales. That's my favorite type of person to work with, because I think it's very like, it's very related to my mission. I just want to change how the world thinks about sales. And so I think if like the more minorities, engineers, non-stereotypical salespeople and founders can be part of that story, I think it will become a much more noble profession. So that's the type of people I like to work with. I had a video on YouTube once where I talked about sales as almost like diplomacy, because you're like collaborating with the people you're selling to. And then I had like a bunch of diplomats reach out, right? And so that is highly fulfilling to me, when people outside of my kind of direct domain are like, hey, I want to learn about what you do, which is why I like working with those types of people. And then I'll give you an obvious one too. AI is really interesting right now. Most of my clients have AI baked into their product. And so that's also really fun for me to work through, because I think AI is very early, and I think most companies are adopting it the wrong way. I think most companies are thinking about AI as like a button push, when there's still a very human component to adopting AI, right? So I like working with AI founders, because they also have a lot of pressure from venture capitalists. There are a lot of VCs are like, hey, why can't you go from 0 to 5 million in revenue within a year? Very unnatural motion, right? And so I like to kind of untrain, hey, like, don't listen to those folks, right? Because if you go from 0 to 5 million in a year, you're going to lose a lot of customers in year 2, right? Because a lot of customers are going to be like, this isn't doing what I thought it would do, right? So I like working with AI founders too, because I think there's like very real like change management, if that makes sense. Like there's a very real human aspect to adopting AI that most companies are missing. Yeah.
Really quick, what's a venture capitalist?
Oh, so venture capitalists is a group of companies that give startups money to basically get them off the ground, to get them started. And the model is, why do venture capitalists give money to startups, is because when Google got their first check, they were valued at, I don't know, like less than $1 million, but now Google is valued at multi-billions of dollars, right? So that return, that change, VCs who give money investing in those companies, they make that, you know, in terms of their profit. So there's a lot of venture capitalists that'll raise money from organizations and wealthy individuals and then invest them in startups to get their start. Yeah. Yeah, that is such a great, I'm glad you brought that up. So at Google, I was hired with maybe 100 other recent grads, and I wasn't directly in sales in the beginning. They put us in a room like this with a bunch of like dividers, and I was part of the team manning the toll-free line 8662 Google. Like if you rang that line, it would ring our phones. And then I would also do chat support. So if somebody chatted in to Google, it was my team. And that was interesting. So it's not like it was like customer support, right? And we were taking like 40 calls a day. Sometimes people thought we broke their internet, and I'd have to be like, it's not us, that's your internet provider. Sometimes people would be calling, they'd be like, I'm trying to use Google Maps, it's not working. I'd be like, like that's not what we do. But the thing that job taught me is how to actually adjust my tone based off of who was calling me. Because if you're talking to 40 people a day, you got to be on your game. Sometimes you got to be educational. Sometimes you got to resolve somebody who's really upset that, they think Google stole their money for some reason, or their ad review has been taking weeks, right? So how did I transition from that? I had mentors who are on the television ads team, and they're like, this is what I'm doing. Are you interested in shadowing a few of my calls? So I would shadow their calls and I'd be like, wow, this is fascinating. You're only working with 10 customers that are paying you $50 million. Like, how does that work? I'm talking to 40 customers a day. Some of them are paying us $2 a day, right? So I was like, how does that work where you could actually sell these big deals? And what I realized was that I have a passion for helping people, and I loved the rapid pace of talking to different businesses, but I also had a passion for understanding how to make money because I didn't have a ton of money growing up as a kid. So I was like, okay, like how does this topic work around generating revenue? And so that's how I shifted. So I don't know if that's helpful, but yeah, it takes multiple, I think, iterations of going through different companies to figure out what you want, but it has to still land on a core passion in terms of skill sets. For me, it's talking to people, helping people. That was my start. And then I wanted to figure out this money generation part. Might be something else for you, right? But yeah, hopefully, I don't know if that's helpful. Yeah. So my piece of advice, I think it's related to what I was saying, is start with something that you're an expert in, which is yourself. So start with your story. And I think that usually gets people comfortable. I've had the same thing. I still get nervous on a one-on-one Zoom call, by the way, with a prospective client. And that's the reason why I start with, let me tell you about why I do what I do. So think about that, right? Why do you do what you do? What is personal to you that nobody else can speak about that you could start with when you're presenting, right? It's not about just your product. It's about your passion. So start with that. And then the last thing I'll say is nervousness is good. If you're not nervous, you don't care. And that's what I tell my clients too, right? And that's why after, however many years in sales for me, I still get nervous in front of customers. I was nervous, in fact, to speak in front of you guys too. So I was like, I don't remember what it's like to be in high school. I hope they actually like my story. So it's good because it makes you prepare and it helps you focus on what you're an expert on, which is yourself and your identity.
Awesome. Let's give a round of applause.
Cool. Thank you guys. Appreciate it.